but you can start turning. It's in the Old Testament. So this happened a long, long time ago. It's about three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three young men, they were Israelites. They were Hebrews. But here's the thing. They were actually living in exile. They had been taken from their homes. And the history of this region is pretty interesting. There was this guy. He was the king of Babylon. I say this guy, but he was probably, at the time, one of the most powerful person in the world. And he was King Nebuchadnezzar. That's his name, Nebuchadnezzar. And this guy, he did not believe in God. He was a polytheist. He thought there were lots of different gods. But we're going to see, as we read this, that the reality is that he thought he was his own God. He thought that there was no religious God that was more powerful than him. And so in his quest for dominion over this huge region, King Nebuchadnezzar attacked the nation of Israel. And he did this actually on several occasions, and eventually he left all of Israel completely desolate. And just a little side point here, that region, that nation of Israel continues even to this day to face challenges, right? Where there's war going on over there even today. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he took all the Israelites captive. He brought them to his capital of Babylon. That's pretty insulting and degrading. This was their home, their land, and he gathers them up, makes them come to Babylon. And then, if that wasn't degrading enough, what he does is he takes the most intelligent and strongest young men, and he takes them from Israel, from his captives, and he takes those young men out of their families, away from their homes or their family groups, and then he puts them into this training program. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who we're talking about there, they were part of this. It really was an elite training program. Even though it was headed by the guy who took them captive, it was for the best of the Israelites. And so they went through this with flying colors, and there's some really cool stories about how they did that, but we won't focus on that today. But when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego finished their training program, they were then put in charge of managing parts of the capital of Babylon. So they were in positions of responsibility and honor. Now, I would guess that many of you had times when you were blessed and you were put in a position of honor or power or responsibility. Have there been times that people around you didn't handle that very well? Maybe they didn't really appreciate that you got the promotion or that you got the position that they wanted. They can get jealous. They can get concerned about their own reputation, and then that becomes a problem for you, right? Has anyone experienced that? It happens sometimes. Well, that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were facing. There were these astronomers or astrologers, and they were called Chaldeans in Babylon. And they were threatened by these three Israelite young men because they were jealous. They didn't like that these men had been put into power. So that's kind of the setting of where we are. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not in their homeland. They're captives, but they've been put into a position of power. So King Nebuchadnezzar, let's talk about him for a minute. He had a very big ego. So big that one day he decides, hey, I want a statue built in honor of me. So he ordered a 90-foot tall golden statue to be created in his own honor. So he had his slaves and his workers and his artists get this statue completed. So they work and they work and they work. It's done. It wasn't just enough for Nebuchadnezzar to have this statue, though. He wanted people to bow down to this image of him and to worship it. And so in order to enforce his order, he had a huge furnace built. And he warned the people, if you refuse to bow, if you don't follow my orders and don't bow down before this image of me, then you will immediately be thrown into this furnace. He was ruling by fear, right? So the statue is completed, and when it came time to dedicate the statue, he ordered all of the officials, all the important people to gather at the side of the statue. And all of these people were like governors and mayors and treasurers, policemen, judges, everyone who was in the government was ordered to gather for this huge event. Now, remember, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were part of the government here. They were officials in the capital city, so they had to be there. So Nebuchadnezzar had his royal band there, and they had a herald announce to the group, when the music starts, everyone has to fall down to the ground and worship the golden image of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now here, remember I told you about the Chaldeans. These were these guys that were kind of jealous of the Hebrews. This was an opportunity for them to mess things up for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they were aware that the Hebrews were faithful to their God. They had a reputation for faithfulness. And this story is all about faithfulness, the faithfulness of God and the faithfulness of these three men. But they had a reputation for faithfulness. And the Bible doesn't say this, but I think that whenever the herald announced and the trumpets played, hey, everyone bow down, I think the Chaldeans, they weren't bowing down either. I think they were looking around. They were watching Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because they knew that these guys had one God that they worshiped, that they were faithful to. So they were just waiting, looking around, waiting for something to happen, and they were not disappointed. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would not bow down to worship the statue. And the Chaldeans then immediately went to Nebuchadnezzar and they told him, hey, this is what we saw. So now Nebuchadnezzar's huge ego is bruised and he goes into a rage. He says, get them in front of me right now, front and center, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he gives them one more chance. He's like, I'll give you one more chance to do what I ordered and for you to bow down and worship this golden image. And if you don't, then you're going to be killed. Okay, so now we're going to look in Daniel chapter 3 and we're going to see how this conversation goes between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. It says this. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. All right, so if this was a normal day in ancient Babylon, that would have been the end of this whole story. Right? Nebuchadnezzar's ego would have been stroked. The Chaldeans would have gotten rid of these guys that they were jealous of. And the 3 Hebrews, they're dead. But this is not a normal day. And remember what I said at the beginning. This is not just a story. This actually happened. This is not a normal day in Babylon. God decides to do an unusual thing in Babylon on this day. So let's continue reading verse 24. It says, Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste, and he declared to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? And they answered and said to the king, True, O king. He answered and said, But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like the son of the gods. So 3 men went into a fire that was so hot that it actually killed the men who were standing nearby. And now they see not 3, but 4 men walking around in this furnace. And Nebuchadnezzar yells into the furnace. He's like, Hey, you guys come on out here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they walk out. There's no sign of injury, no sign of fire. Their clothes don't even smell like smoke. And Nebuchadnezzar is astonished. He's profoundly affected by this miracle he's just seen. And then verse 28, he says this, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. What a change of tides, right? In the beginning, he's like, there's no God that can do what I can do. And all of a sudden now he's announcing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God is the one that we need to serve. So again, this is a story of faithfulness. We see the faithfulness of the three servants of God. We see the faithfulness of God as he moves in their midst. I want to talk a minute about faith. You know, faith isn't limited to just religious people. The difference between the Christian believer and someone who's not a Christian or has no religious faith is they have faith. It's just that the object of that faith is different. And here's what I mean by that. Everyone believes in something. Everyone believes things that you can't necessarily prove. There was a philosopher that said, faith is one of the forces by which men live. Faith is one of the forces by which men live. He didn't say by which religious people live. He just said that's how we live. And he's right. People, religious or not, act in faith every day. Some simple examples are this. When you step into an elevator, right, you have faith that that elevator is going to hold your weight, that when you push the button, it's going to take you to the floor that you're going to go to. Right? You have faith in that. When people get married, they say their marriage vows. They have faith that their husband or wife who they're marrying is going to keep those vows. There's lots of different ways that we live by faith, whether we have faith in God or not. So the Christian believer lives by faith in the living God and in what he has revealed in the Bible. And so don't fool yourselves, and especially don't allow others to fool you into thinking that they don't have faith. We all believe in something. And having faith does not make us less intellectual. It does not make us less curious. Our faith in Jesus does not make us less, because everyone has faith in something. All right? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had faith. And I love, just like Chaplain Lindsay said, I love how they respond to Nebuchadnezzar when he demands an explanation for their disobedience. With just this huge amount of faith, but it's a simple faith. They just say, we don't have to defend ourselves here. We know our God. And they said he is able to deliver us. They don't presume that God is, because he said if he doesn't, then still. So for them, the reality of God doesn't rest on whether or not he saved them from the fire. Right? God exists to them whether they walk out of that furnace or they don't. They knew he could, and they knew it was up to God how he would respond, to save them or to let them die in that fire. They weren't concerned about themselves. They weren't afraid of the king. Their only concern was obeying the Lord and giving a faithful witness to all of those people who were gathered around there. So their words actually were few, but they were well chosen. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they could have compromised with the king. They could have defended their disobedience. They could have rationalized. They could have bowed down and told themselves, you know what, everybody else is doing it. They could have said, you know what, we're officials in this government, and our office demands that we obey. You know, they could have said, you know what, we'll bow our knees, but we won't really mean it in our heart. But true faith doesn't look for loopholes. It just obeys God and knows that God will do what is best. So faith rests on the commands of God and the promises of God. It doesn't rest on our arguments and our explanations. So we can learn a lot from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego about godly, faith-filled responses to challenges. And I think this is notable here. The Bible doesn't mention any prayers by the Hebrews during this ordeal. You see, they had been in prayer so regularly. They had such a familiar relationship with God. They talked with him all the time that they didn't need to pray for deliverance right then. They were already prayed up. And we know this about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because before this whole fiery furnace ordeal, their leader, Daniel, who's the author of this book, Daniel was facing an issue, and he actually went to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel writes about that, and he says, hey, I need you to pray for me. So these were prayer warriors. They were already prayed up before the big test came. Did you catch that? I wonder if you can say that about your relationship with God. Are you already prayed up right now for the test that you haven't even gone through yet? The test that's coming next week or next month or next year. You know, too often we don't even go to God until we're in the middle of the thing, right? You're going through a hard time and you're like, this is tough. Maybe I should pray right now. We all do that. I'm not even going to ask you to raise your hand. I know we all do that. I've done it myself. I would say at least you're crying out to God at some point, but that, waiting until you're in the struggle, is not a faith-filled life. That is not a peace-filled life. If you wait until your soul is troubled to start praying, you're losing peace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were full of faith, and their faith resulted in a supernatural peace. They were facing their death, but they weren't scared in front of this really just an insane king. So they were already prayed up. That's my first point. My second point is they looked up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't make this whole situation about Nebuchadnezzar, who was trying to set himself up as a god. He said, who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Like, what? Your God's not bigger than me. Now imagine for a believer in God, what a huge insult that is. This man is saying he's more powerful than God, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not lose their minds when King Nebuchadnezzar said that, which they could have, right? A lot of Christians today would have lost their ever-loving minds if someone were to insult their God. But they didn't. They just said, you know what? God can deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he can deliver us from you. They didn't make it about Nebuchadnezzar. They didn't make it about the Chaldeans, who were the ones that went and snitched. They could have tried to, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have tried to pull rank, point fingers at the Chaldeans, threw them under the bus, but that wasn't even part of the response. Chaldeans were not even in their mind. So in your struggles, don't make it about the others. Don't make it about the guy that's causing the problems or the others who are jealous of you, right? What we saw from these men was that they looked up. It was all about God. Their whole response was about their God and how faithful he was. So they looked up. And the third thing they did was they shut up. And what I mean by this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not say, we told you so. If there was ever a time in the history of the world to gloat, this was it. They were walking around in a fire and they didn't get hurt. And Nebuchadnezzar was so arrogant before this. It would have been a really good time to shove it in his face, right? But they didn't do that. They were still respectful. I think the first line of that song we sang, it says, there's a grace when the heart is under fire. I love that line. God gives us grace in our heart to treat people the way he wants us to. So they didn't have to gloat. They didn't shove it in his face. They shut up. So these are some examples of how to behave in challenging situations. Number one, be prayed up before the event happens. Number two, look up. And number three, sometimes we got to shut up. Now, I will admit, sometimes this was a very specific situation. There will be times when these methods don't work. The Bible doesn't say do this every time, follow this every time. Sometimes there are different ways that God would have us to react. But I would say when you're in a challenge, ask the Holy Spirit, is this one of those instances where I should be looking at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and responding how they did? I believe that many times their example will be the right response. So just remember that. Be prayed up. Look up. Shut up. Now, there's one other thing I want to talk about today, and this is the question of why. Why did God save them? Did God save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for their own sake? So let's think about that for a moment. If they had been killed, Psalms 23 says this, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So this psalm actually predates Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was written before they were born. And so they were faithful men. They probably knew this psalm that explained that after their physical death, they would be with God. They were probably familiar with Psalm 73 that says, "You guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will take me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you." They knew that if they were killed in the fire, then they would be with God. This is the God that meant so much to them that they would die for him. The God to whom they had been faithful their whole lives. They knew God, and they knew that after the fire, if God didn't save them, they would get to be with him. So clearly, being delivered from the fire was not for their own benefit. Aside from a few seconds of pain, and by the way, if you think about it, this fire was 7 times hotter than it was normally. That 7 times hotter fire would have actually killed them faster. So a few seconds of pain, then death was actually the best way out for them. They wouldn't be in exile anymore. They wouldn't have to deal with the conflict of serving a pagan king. So it wasn't for their benefit to be delivered from the fiery furnace. If it wasn't then what was it? Why did God do this? Here's why. It was to reveal the one who can deliver. It was to show believers and non-believers for thousands of years to come that there will be another in the fire standing next to me. It's to show that even though we should be burned up because of our sin, the fourth man in that fire, Jesus, he defeated the fire of hell. So there's another explanation for this that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't even know because it hadn't even been revealed yet. That Jesus gives us victory over hell and death and the grave. So if God intervened in the execution of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, then we wouldn't have been able to hear about this fourth man in this way. He kept them alive. He saved them so that we would understand who Jesus is a little bit better. It was a message for us today, for you and for me, in 2025, thousands of years after this event. So I want to ask you, are you hearing the message? Do you hear the message that God is sending through this event? Telling you that he will be here with you, that when times are hard, even when you feel like you're in exile, when it seems like there's evil all around you, it's okay because he is there with you. Whatever you're going through, he is there. He hasn't forsaken you. God knows you and he cares about you. He cares about what you're going through, and he rewards faithfulness in the midst of struggle. So are you hearing that message? And as you're hearing the message, then the question is, how are you going to respond? What is your answer to God as he shows you this truth? And I hope that my answer is that your answer would be, God, I'll be faithful. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's faithfulness allowed God to work on their behalf and to save them, which wasn't even the best option. But it also impacted the whole kingdom of Babylon. Remember, after this display of faithfulness and this miraculous appearance of God, Nebuchadnezzar tells the whole kingdom they need to worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he calls him the Most High God. So if we can apply this lesson to our lives, what is it that is challenging your faith? What is it in your life that's trying to pull you away from God, that's hindering your faithfulness? Is it your own sinful desires? Is it your selfishness, your fear, your doubt, relationships? I don't know. Only you know. The list can go on. But what is demanding your allegiance that is contrary to God's will? And I wonder if you'll continue to be faithful to God despite those challenges. Will you refuse to bow to that thing, whatever it is? And will you accept the consequences of faithfulness, trusting that God will be with you? We learn from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that as believers in the one true God, we will never be able to bring the world to Christ by becoming like the world. We have to be faithful. And in that faithfulness, we can reveal to the world, God can reveal himself in our actions, that there is a higher power, that there is a greater purpose, that there is a superior morality than the world in which we're living. And that comes from the Most High God. So if we are put before the fiery furnace, we can reveal the one who will be there with us and who can deliver us from it. But there's another in the fire, and his name is Jesus.